Good evening, and thank you for joining us again for the second part of our two-part webinar series for public school teachers, administrators, and other school personnel. Hello, I'm Victoria Cobb, president of the Family Foundation, and I am glad that you have decided to join us again tonight for another important webinar. In this seminar, we're going to be discussing the topic of transgenderism in schools among the youth and the policies that some local school boards are pushing on students. I'll just, as a point of reference, mention that we have been just this week up in Loudoun County. Maybe you've been reading about Loudoun County on the news. It has been sort of the epicenter of this battle, and actually the battle we talked about last week on critical race theory. But you might recall the reason this has really been brought to the forefront for teachers, in addition to policies that they're seeing starting to be passed in their school boards, is that in Loudoun County, that's where we saw a teacher, Tanner Cross, basically simply come to a school board meeting, and he is a phys ed teacher. He went to the microphone and simply opposed a policy that, in fact, he believes would violate his faith. He said, look, I'm a phys ed teacher. I can't teach a boy that he can become a girl. And also I serve God, and I don't believe that I can sort of defile what is true. And for that, he was put on administrative leave. And thankfully, Alliance Defending Freedom is defending him, and they are working through the lawsuit side of things. And he won his first round. Loudoun County is appealing, but this has sort of put teachers on high alert. And then the next school board meeting in that county, as you might be aware, resulted in them that the ire of parents was so strong that the school board felt the need to shut down the conversation about these tough topics. And it resulted in some folks getting arrested simply for trying to make their voices heard. And then just this week, they finally did adopt these difficult policies. And during that meeting, folks might have seen that one public school teacher stepped up to the microphone and just spoke from her heart about the need to, well, first for her love for the students and for teaching. And then she actually basically resigned right in front of the board. And it was an emotional moment if you saw it, but our hearts are out for you guys as public school teachers. But I do want to say this, it is not all losses, meaning not all school boards are taking this road. And so I hope some of you might be joining us from counties that are rejecting the transgender model policies. So if you remember, this all started because a law was passed at the General Assembly that forced the Virginia Department of Education to put transgender model guidelines in place. And then it said every school board shall pass these policies. And so even though somebody like Loudoun County hasn't passed the policies that we would like to see, we've seen this outpouring of parental involvement. And in some counties, we've actually seen them rejecting the policies. Russell County was a great example of one of the first counties that the school board simply said, look, we're the ones actually given the care over children in our community, not some Richmond mandate. And actually they stood against it. And we have seen that these model policies are igniting just a big battle in lots of locations, but we're also seeing that Tazewell and Louisa County and a fair number, Campbell, and there's a fair number of counties that are pushing back on this. So we hope some of you might be joining us from those counties, and we're thrilled that you might not have to embrace this at this moment in your school system, but it makes it no less important. Around the country, this issue is invading our school systems, and these model policies went to a great degree of extremism on the issue of transgenderism. And so just to kind of reiterate what the model policy looks like. Now, each county might make slight variations on this, but this cultural issue put into these guidelines is really reaching out for everybody and affecting everybody. And so what's in these model guidelines, we basically talk about three major problems. There are many minor problems, but the first is that in fact, it does ensure that anyone of any gender can walk into private spaces that were designed for biological girls or designed for biological boys. And teachers should not question that. So there is a safety privacy issue at play in the model policies. And so far, any county that has adopted any variation of these has included that element. The second component is compelled pronouns. You're probably familiar with this. The model policies say that basically teachers and students will use the pronouns of choice for other individuals. And the third piece is a parent deception piece. So this is simply telling folks, oh, by the way, if the child, let's say it's a biological boy, I say, if Johnny believes that he feels like he is a Susie, the school district will accommodate him as a female, as if he were a female, allow him in the private spaces on the, sports teams, whatever, use all the pronouns. But if Johnny's parents are, quote, non-affirming, and Johnny's doing this outside of his family structure, then the school will essentially treat Johnny like Susie within the walls, but when they deal with Johnny's parents, they'll go back to acting as if they're treating him like a biological boy. So there's a parent deception component that's really significant in this. And so this is a big deal. There are other pieces, but those are kind of the big ones. And I remind people, this is not something where a child has documented their gender dysphoria. They have gone through hormone changes, or they have made body mutilations. We'll talk about just the horrors that go with this. But this is really just if someone feels a certain way on a certain day, they can declare pronouns and walk into bathrooms. And so that is part of the biggest risk with these policies. So in tonight's webinar, we're just going to discuss this issue, and we're going to do it with our friend Brandon Showalter and Josh Hetzler, who is the legal counsel from the Founding Freedoms Law Center, which is our legal arm at the Family Foundation. But teachers all over Virginia have been hearing about this, and they've been contacting our office for advice on what to do. They're asking, what happens if I use the wrong pronouns? Will I get fired? If I stop a boy from walking into a girls' changing facility, will I get disciplined? Should I do as the school instructs, or withhold certain information, and withhold certain information from parents? Some are saying, how do I live out my biblical values in the public school? These are real concerns brought to us by many of you. And so we hope tonight we can help. We don't have all the answers, but we hope we can start the conversation and maybe make some suggestions, and that you can walk out tonight more informed than you were before you came. So before we meet our guests, I just want to remind you that in order to avoid any distractions, the attendees will be muted. So you're all muted during the entire webinar. But if you have a question, just submit it through the Q&A chat feature in our webinar. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's an option to submit a question. So just go ahead, and then our web administrator is going to help facilitate and make sure that we get the questions. So that is kind of the method here, but we want to start by introducing our guest. And I'm just going to give a little of his bio, and we're going to just start by introducing Brandon. Brandon Showalter has been a journalist with the Christian Post for the past 5 years, reporting on a wide variety of topics of theological interest, and has been the main reporter at the publication, covering the many developments in the global gender identity movement. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts in International Studies and Spanish from Bridgewater College of Virginia in 2007. This is one of my favorite parts of his bio. He's a fellow of the John Jay Institute for Faith, Society, and Law. I love that because I serve on the board there, and we're just amazed at where folks have gone with their lives after being part of that program. Anyway, and he graduated in 2015 from a 3-year non-degree program at Bethel School of Ministry in Redding, California. He left full-time reporting in August, and he's about to begin graduate studies, a program in pursuit of a Master's of Arts degree in Human Rights at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Brandon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Victoria. It's a privilege to be here.
We are so glad to have you. We're so appreciative of the work that you've done. We talked a lot. He and I were together at an event this morning, and we talked a lot about just how hard it is to get the truth out there. And so we feel like you have been a warrior in the journalism world to try to just be honest about the difficulties of this issue, and not be like the mainstream media that coats over all of this and makes it seem like it's perfectly healthy, normal, and good for our children. And you have brought forward a lot of pieces that are people telling their stories saying this is not so. So you've studied and written extensively on this topic of transgenderism. Can you tell us kind of where you think we are in this so-called movement? Can you touch on the speed at which we've progressed. I feel like, I mean, I think of it as sort of starting with the Bergefell decision, but can you just kind of comment on this moment in time with regards to this issue?
Sure. The way I like to think about transgenderism is that it is a medical scandal. And I am very intentional to say it that way because unlike, you know, the Obergefell ruling that you mentioned, this is about biomedical identities. There's a huge pharmaceutical push to dissociate children from the material reality of their sexed bodies. And yes, it does seem like after the Obergefell ruling, this just took off with brutal speed. But people were actually planning this even in the years before that ruling. I remember seeing, I think it was Time magazine with Laverne Cox, this transgender actor. I think it was on in 2014, so it was a year before Obergefell, where the headline read the transgender tipping point. So even before that ruling, this was in the works. Now it's just taken off like wildfire ever since because the LGBTQ organizations are pretty much no longer focused on anything LGB. It's all about P, Q, and the other letters that come after that. But I say it's a medical scandal because schools are a place where children are being inculcated with all of this gender dogma, where they're being taught that they can be dozens of made up gender options. You ask where we are, I think that we are just now starting to realize, the public at large is starting to realize just how much of a crisis and how much of a medical scandal it is, as lawmakers in certain states are starting to push back against the medical aspect of this, and the ideology is becoming much more scrutinized in schools and in other public arenas, especially sports and in other places of public accommodation. But the media, mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream mass media has been so active in the suppression of thought about this issue in particular. It won't allow dialogue on the subject at all. They insist upon framing it as a right versus left issue. And I can tell you that I hear from all kinds of people from across the political spectrum, Christian and non-Christian, including gays and lesbians, radical feminists, a wide swath of people who are adamantly opposed to this ideology, but their voices can't get heard in the Washington Post, New York Times, NPR, traditional legacy media outlets. And so it's a very confusing issue because there's been so much manipulation and deceitfulness surrounding it, especially in the press. And I think it's just a matter of if our voices get heard and if the voices that are very thoughtful on the left get heard that are also pushing back against this, it's only a matter of time before this entire thing collapses because the gender identity activist movement has to have 100% grip, watertight hold on the narrative. And if they lose that at all, they will lose everything. And I think it's illustrative that 60 Minutes episode from a few weeks ago included a 7-minute segment on detransitioners, those who once identified as trans, underwent these radical interventions and came to regret it. Transgender activists were absolutely furious. And I believe I even heard Leslie Stahl say, or I read, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure this was the case, that they never had so much pushback before an episode went to air. The very fact that they were even airing the concerns of detransitioners who said this was a disaster for me enraged those who tried to get that segment shut out. They just wanted it to be completely sympathetic, and most of it was to transgender activists and their claims about the human body. So it's a very precarious kind of time. I think the public is just now starting to wake up, but it's sad because there are many people, many young people who have been gravely harmed by it, and their voices just aren't being heard. And it's especially bad in the schools where they're being taught that this is true, and it's not.
Yeah, we know some folks who have detransitioned. We've had them with different events that we've done. Walt Hare is a gentleman that has a ministry to those folks. James Shoup was the first non-binary. He got that first driver's license in Oregon. And some of these stories are they're truly tragic. And yet, I think it would seem mainstream media wants to pretend these people don't exist. So what was the moment that you became concerned or you felt impressed to begin looking into this as a reporter? So how did you treat this differently than everybody else?
There were two things that happened. My grid for this when I first started in journalism approximately 5 years ago was I thought transgenderism was just those few people at Mardi Gras in New Orleans. I knew a little bit about inner workings of the LGBT movement just from reading news. And what I noticed when I was actually a journalist myself, I saw how quickly the language was being shifted and manipulated within news coverage, and to the point where I couldn't even understand what was being communicated in, mainstream coverage, where they would be referring to a biological male as she and her, and I couldn't even follow the article because it was so confusing, even from a grammar standpoint. It was just, this is so bizarre. So that was really alarming to me, just as someone who works with words. And I realized how they were hijacking the public mind. They were trying to overwrite the truth of biology with, language that you couldn't even follow. But what really kind of tipped me was learning about what puberty blockers were and how they were being used despite lack of FDA approval for the indication of gender dysphoria in children. And I think that was probably in early 2017. And I just have often said that something inside me kind of snapped. I just thought, how in the world are we, blocking natural puberty in children? And it's being billed as life-saving healthcare. Just at a gut level, I knew this was deeply, deeply wrong. And I saw how the mass media, again, was refusing to scrutinize it or criticize it in any way because they don't dare cross the wishes of the LGBTQ crowd. And again, it's mostly about the T these days. Many gays and lesbians are adamantly opposed to all of this. Not all, but some are. And so I just knew that I had to continue to expose it because it's a medical scandal. And I soon then started hearing from parents whose daughters had gone on testosterone. They'd gone into Planned Parenthood and gotten testosterone, and they were growing beards and they're getting buzzy voices, and health effects on their bodies were just horrific, becoming sterilized because the combination of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones yields the foreclosure of your fertility, other health effects. I saw how much of a medical scandal it was. And if journalists should scrutinize or expose anything, I think medical scandals are right up there. And then only conservative-leaning outlets, Christian media, and some courageous radical feminists and a few gays and lesbians that have been willing to say, oh, no, the emperor has no clothes. The medical horrors and the atrocities really have inspired me to keep going. It's been a brutal pursuit, but you got to shine a light on the darkness here.
Yeah, no, and I so appreciate just the fact that I connect with the fact that you sort of talked about, as a journalist, you saw the words change and you saw the language. I shared this earlier today, but I just noticed this change and even this definition of cisgender, right? So cisgender wasn't even a thing. I mean, I don't know how many years ago, nobody knew what that was. And then we were taught, no, this is the thing where we're people who align with, I'm cisgender because I am a female in my gender, and that aligns with, and they used to use this term, sex assigned at birth, right? So that meant like it was random, of course, it wasn't actually connected to my DNA, but it's crazy because even that is changing. I noticed the other day that this definition is now, and I pulled it up to share with us tonight. This definition now says an adjective describing a person whose gender identity corresponds with the gender society typically associates with the sex they were assigned at birth. So now it's not even, that your gender is connected to your sex assignment at birth. It's what society has typically, so that we can make sure that when that changes, we can change that. It's a constantly revolving door, and that should be a tip off to folks. And I'm amazed at how people don't seem to notice that words are changing and meanings are changing, and we're all supposed to get with the program, and we're supposed to forget that what words meant last year and act as if we've become enlightened. So I appreciate your point there.
That's actually very critical because it's a key thing you just highlighted. This entire movement thrives upon the constant gaslighting and confusion of people. Just as people think they're trying to figure this out, or they'll weaponize empathy and compassion, because if there's someone who's truly experiencing gender confusion, perhaps because of a trauma or some kind of psychiatric issue, I mean, who wouldn't have compassion for someone like that? I certainly would. But constant changing of definitions, all of this word salad that is constantly thrown, it's purposeful. It's intentional to try and keep people confused so that they can never quite get their head around it. And meanwhile, they're, furthering their goals. They're moving the goalposts constantly. I tell people, don't even say the word gender. Say sex. Material reality of the sexed body, we're male and female. And I know we use the word sex and gender interchangeably. And if you look at the etymology of the word gender, you see the word gene as in genetics. And so it sort of connects it there, even biological sex. But if you get lost in the gender weeds, just anchor yourself in the truth of XY and XX chromosomes, which Our DNA is stamped on every single cell of our bodies. Don't lie. They are what they are. Male and female. That's it. That's our physiology. Just keep it simple.
No, I so appreciate that. And I appreciate your statement. I think, we can't be clear enough that we are not speaking for lack of compassion on kids who truly struggle. This isn't about some kind of dislike or some kind of bad feeling. This is actually the opposite. This is actually the overwhelming sense of care and compassion for all children that would lead us to say we must be truth tellers on this situation, because more and more will be harmed for this pseudo niceness that we've created around this issue.
Right.
That is truly not actually for anyone's best interest in the long term. Let me ask you this, and this can be a difficult question, but is there something that you think is behind sort of this overnight change in dialogue, or this switch from a big push on gay marriage to now transgenderism? And I'll qualify that by saying not everyone who is speaking about this, who has been caught up in this, has some deep underlying agenda, right? So we have to sort of separate. There are people who are just on the bus, but they don't know where the bus is going. But is there something that you sort of sense is like, why is this happening?
A lot of money that's driving this push to, as I said a moment ago, dissociate children from their sex bodies, because this entire project is underpinned by the lie that it's actually possible to be born in the wrong body. If a child can go on puberty blockers and sex hormones, if there's a medicalized push, a therapeutic and medicalized push, there's a lot of money that can be made. So I would say evil folks, the wickedness in high places, if I can use a Christian term there, but I mean, what non-Christians are noticing this too. I'll just say I correspond with a wide variety of people again. There's a lot of money. There's a cottage industry really that sort of facilitates this entire pathway, this therapeutic and then medicalized pathway. Because if a child goes on to these experimental drugs, and I will just say again, they are experimental. None of these high-powered substances have ever been subjected to any kind of long-term testing, longitudinal studies, or research to measure their efficacy and safety in children. If you go on them, you'll be a medical patient for life. There's quite a handsome income stream for decades if you can get a child to be tethered to the medical industrial establishment for decades. And it's not conspiratorial to think that way. Just follow the money. And and if I can point people to research that documents some of these pharma income streams, the medical products that are being pushed and sold and marketed to young people, many of whom are suffering already from mental health struggles and other, psychiatric comorbidities. There's a lot of money to be made. And again, I just say again, you're not conspiratorial to think that way, because what explains this? I mean, this wasn't even a thing a decade ago. All of a sudden, it's just manifested out of nowhere. No, there's people who have a vested interest who stand to profit handsomely off of, sending young people, many of them vulnerable, down this path. So that's what's behind the curtain.
And I mean, we at the Family Foundation have a particular interest in following the money when we see now that Planned Parenthood is doing cross-sex hormones. They figured it out and they jumped in on the game. And the irony of all irony is in theory, they're about reproductive rights. And yet what literally they are doing is helping sterilize people. At the end of the game, that's where this leads. And so it is a little bit of a shocker. But again, we know there's not an understanding of human life and an emphasis on the value of human life. So when you put it all together, it kind of makes sense. But they got in on the money game, like to your point. They figured out this is a stream and it's worthy of pursuit.
Yes. And I'll just say to that point, I once did an investigative piece where a mother called me after her daughter at age 18 had gone to Planned Parenthood and got testosterone within half an hour, I believe. And this daughter had a developmental delay. She had some other mental health issues, and all she had to do was say that she was the opposite sex, and they took a finger stick and I think her blood pressure, and she got it. So this mother decided, well, I'm going to go and if I can get testosterone at age 57. And they gave it to her within, 30 minutes. So I followed up with a phone call to Planned Parenthood and I said, oh, I'm interested in exploring this hormonal regimen. I think I'm transgender. I'd like to do this, but I do have a question for you. I've been told that the frontal lobe, the brain doesn't stop developing. Neuroscience says that 25. That's when the science says that. Should I be concerned about that? And the representative from Planned Parenthood told me, and I quote, "That sounds like smoke coming out of nowhere." They're not in any way concerned about the actual science. This is all about selling drugs.
And we know, I mean, children are often the focus of a social experiment. Raising
Right.
children with same-sex parents, sex education, and medical experience with puberty blockers. So, we know there's some overall harm to kids. Maybe there's more you need to tell us about that. But I'm wondering, where are the groups that are supposed to that proclaim that they're all about protecting the health of kids? I feel like there's this huge emphasis on that, and yet there's a little bit of silence from some of them. Is that accurate?
What has been astonishing has been the institutional capture of so much of society. So many professions have been corrupted. So many quote unquote mainstream organizations have been bought off or are themselves corrupted. Pediatricians organizations, social workers, school guidance counselors, any kind of professional organization. This gender money, the pharma money and all of its tentacles has thoroughly corrupted things from the top. And the line that they will feed you is that if you don't affirm a child in their self-declared gender identity, that child is at increased risk or in fact will commit suicide. That's the manipulative threat that is used as a weapon to scare people into thinking that this is life-saving healthcare, when in fact, I'll just say again, these drugs are completely experimental. We don't even have good data on any of these, procedures, and that itself, I think, is a medical scandal. Like, we should be able to track this. We need good numbers to be able to measure efficacy and see that all of this is really safe and that kind of thing, but we don't have them. And so it's been brutally astounding. I full speed. It just makes my head swim when I see. You would think that people who care about children and look out for their best interests, their physical health, their mental health, would at least have some pause before you send kids down this road. But no, in fact, some of these groups are in fact pushing this actively. It's put to parents sometimes, well, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter? That's the kind of really dark, ugly manipulation that they are told in professional settings where, especially if they don't have a medical background, they don't have any expertise. It's very challenging for them to say, wait a minute, I don't know if I agree with this or not. It's quite insidious.
Mm. And I know a lot of people think of this as a matter of affirmation. They think of it as helping someone feel good about themselves. And I would say most people don't let their thoughts go to the fact that for this child is likely to result in a long road that is a medical road. It isn't about, it starts about the brain, right? That, this is how somebody feels. But I don't think most of us like to think about, because the uncomfortable part, and we don't have to get into all of that now, but there is no way for a boy to become a girl. There's no way for a girl to become a boy. And when you attempt to try, it's a horrific path. And so it is a little shocking that we don't have, I read about the American Medical Association the other day, and that they're basically saying we should just pull biology off of people's birth certificates altogether. That didn't say it that way. That's my way of saying what they're saying. So really, a doctor is not going to know from documentation what they're dealing with. And we saw, I don't know if you heard the news story a while ago, but there was literally a stillborn baby born out of a female because she believed she was a male. So they never ran a pregnancy test. They didn't have the proper care. And sure enough, we had a loss of an unborn child, and I'm sure tragedy to the individual. But that's where this leads. And I think we sort of know that, but yet it continues to happen.
It's absolutely insane what's happening. The idea that you're going to take a sex marker off of a legal document like a birth certificate or a driver's license or any other identity form, and especially in a medical setting where if you're in an emergency room, you have to make quick life and death decisions based on biological sex. It's one of the most basic facts in their being. But this larger gender push is trying to overwrite the truth of biology. It's just unbelievable. I sometimes say if I wasn't the one reporting on some of this stuff, I'm not even sure I would believe it, because it's just so outrageous and crazy. Yes. But that's what's happening. And I will just add to that, though, there is the state of Idaho did pass a law in March of last year. One of them was actually saying only males could compete in, females sports. It was keeping that for women only. There was also a second law that was signed that has not gotten as much attention, but it was saying that in the state of Idaho, public records and vital statistic must be maintained on the basis of biological sex. So criminal, records, birth certificates, all those kinds of things. They're insisting that biological sex is the standard, and it should be. It's just a basic fact that we all need to know. It's unavoidable.
And I know that, as a male, you might not realize this, but anybody that's been any of our female audience would know this. Any medical appointment we walk into, one of the first questions we have to answer is there any chance you could be pregnant? I mean, that is on every possible, I could go to the eye doctor and they're probably going to ask me that question. I kid you not. And so the irony that this stuff doesn't matter, they know better. The medical professionals know that. So
it doesn't work in real life. There comes a breaking point. Sure.
Yeah. Now tell us how this plays out in sports a little bit. So, we have this scenario now where we have boys participating in girls sports, and this goes all the way up to adults. So we now, we're dealing with this at the Olympic level. What is the harm of this transgender movement to women, to girls, to these competitions?
Women and girls are bearing the brunt of this movement for sure. Sports is probably just the most visible arena where you can see the obvious ridiculousness of it. We all know this, that the male body is physically stronger, more musculature, stronger bones, have stronger hearts. Any kind of sport where speed or brute strength is an advantage, males, just because of the effects of male puberty on the body, that gives them an unbridgeable advantage. But now, under the banner of gender identity, males can self-declare as female and enter, their sports, their athletics. Title IX be damned. It's just crazy how much this erodes the rights, privacy, safety of girls. And sports is, I think, helping wake a lot of people up to the insanity of it, because they can just see, okay, this just isn't fair. How in the world can you think that you can put male bodies in female sports and think that there's not going to be any difference or unfair advantage? We'll just look at that. I talk about another issue where you have broad cross-partisan support. I've talked to a Republican congressman who told me that he's getting phone calls from Democrat moms who's like, I didn't vote for you, but please, I thank you for this bill. They want their girls to be able to play on a level playing field. They deserve their own sports. Should absolutely have their own sports.
We were talking about this earlier, but you're a 6'7" male. I really thank you for not trying to be a female and come play in my basketball games, because most of us women are not to that degree, of height. Now there's, there's a rare exception, but there are some obvious scenarios in sports that are a challenge. But that's going to play out in the school system. In Virginia, they have been allowing boys and girls sports for some time now. So these new guidelines actually don't address that, because that was actually the first thing to fall in our public school system. Many people don't realize that because they haven't had to experience it on their specific sports team with their child. But that actually has been a problem in our Commonwealth for longer than this moment that we're in right now. But let me kind of circle back to just the most sensitive kind of topics about this suicide thing. You mentioned it, but that is what we heard throughout all the public policy debates. And honestly, I look at it in a different way, which is Virginia now bans counselors from helping children who are gender dysphoric, who these kids who are struggling, who might not want to be struggling, and they might want to try to get their thoughts to align with their body rather than get their body to align with their thoughts. And now that form of counseling will cost you your counseling license. So I actually think about it the other way, which is, what about those kids and the suicide risk when they can't find help? But tell me, how do we address this? What would you say? Give us a soundbite for why we still have to engage this issue and not roll over simply because we're being told that student's going to end up in a situation where they'll commit suicide.
Need to just say there are so many contributing factors for suicide you can't possibly know with 100% certainty, and that there's no medical literature to show that is the outcome if you affirm the child. What activists on the other side, what gender identity activists will often do, they'll pull out some study from the Williams Institute or some transgender organization with very small sample size. And if you actually look, you'll just see that there's no there there. and if you actually dig deep and you find the medical literature, there are so many contributing factors to suicide, and you can't possibly know that that is going to happen. So that's just dark manipulation, and don't be intimidated by it. Understand that that's manipulation. It's not based on reason. They don't have the data, they don't have the studies. And in fact, there's the study that I think is the most, if you actually want to go digging for a study that is, I think, explains the truth, and this was one done out of Sweden, and it was actually measured, because they have centralized medicine, all of the adults who underwent trans surgeries, the cohort from many years, and they found that there was actually a 19 times higher hazard of completed suicide after these trans interventions. I mean, I think it's actually the reverse is actually true, that if you're sending kids down this pathway where you're experimenting on their bodies, you're actually setting them up for a lot more problems. And so don't let anybody gaslight you and say it's not true that this child will commit suicide. You don't know that. They're not, people who throw it in your face aren't interested in reason. So I don't think there's actually much point. But people should know, people watching should know it's not true. There's no there.
Right.
It's
And we're
not
sowing
there.
confusion.
Yeah.
I really believe we're at the point where we're sowing confusion in kids who didn't previously have confusion by this attempt to normalize.
Oh,
We've
yeah.
actually taken kids who were simply little girls that like to also play with trucks and thrown in a world of confusion and sent them down a road of mental health struggles. So that's the other side that people just haven't really worked through. Now, we got to get to the teacher part of this, because we're moving kind of towards this where we're going to get to exactly where we are in Virginia. But what are some indicators or alarms that teachers should be watching out for as it relates to the health of a student, right? So this is a problem we're going to see right in our classroom. Give us some help there.
Well, your children are being inculcated with this on websites like Tumblr, on YouTube, on social media. This is all around them, whether you're aware of it or not. And so this can happen very suddenly. It blindsides people. There's, in terms of watching what people are doing, you often find that the children that get mired in this are often the outcasts, so the vulnerable kids, those who are already struggling with some other things, social anxiety, depression, the kids who are already having issues, or children on the autism spectrum. Keep a watchful eye on those kids, because they are particularly vulnerable to this kind of propaganda, wherever they receive it, whether it's in the schools or whether it's online or anywhere else. And I think especially, and I don't know how much research has been done about the gender identity and autism link, but what I do know is that kids, especially those on the autism spectrum, often have very obsessive personalities, and they fixate on something. And so this gender dogma, if they latch onto this, it just becomes their be all end all. It just becomes the thing that they're all about. And then often gets them special status at school. And so it sort of reinforces the entire identity nomenclature and all of that. So it becomes very hard to challenge. So just keep an eye on those children who are already struggling, because those are the ones that I think are most vulnerable to this contagion.
All right, we're going to have to shift gears a little bit here. Brandon is going to come back on for some Q&A, but I am going to kind of shift over to Josh Hetzler, who's our legal counsel for the Founding Freedoms Law Center. Just again, some real quick background. As you know, the Virginia Department of Education created these guidelines, and they basically were going to hit 8 areas, and they were compliance with applicable non-discrimination laws. They were maintenance of safety and supportive learning environments, prevention of and response to bullying, maintenance of student records, identification of students, protection of student privacy, confidentiality, all those issues, enforcement of sex-based dress codes, and then also student participation in sex-specific sporting events. So all these things were a piece of what had to come into place. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh and kind of let him explain a little bit about where we are and where we are on a lawsuit side of this as well.
Well, can you hear me, Victoria?
Yep.
All right. Well, after these guidelines became live in March, the Founding Freedoms Law Center decided to challenge them. And one of the reasons we were able to challenge them is because these went through the Administrative Process Act, little something we've gotten used to following very carefully as we watch the regulatory process. And one of the things the agency, the Department of Education, just was sloppy. They didn't follow the law. We had the opportunity in the comment period where over 9,000 people commented. A few of us commented that these violate the law in various ways. Various state and federal laws were violated. And most importantly, we think constitutional rights are violated all throughout these crazy 27-page document, including parental rights, free speech, religious exercise, due process, equal protection, privacy. And so we pointed this out, and they were obligated to respond to us. And the idea being that if they're going to pass a guidance document or regulation and something's violating the law, they need to know about it, and they have an obligation to try to address that. And they didn't. So we had the opportunity to sue them under the Administrative Process Act. And so the Family Foundation, the Founding Freedoms Law Center, and a parent with 2 kids in the public schools, we brought this suit on behalf of them. And the Attorney General who was defending this had one tactic, and that was delay, 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 and kind of knowing if we can run the clock out on this, that school districts are required to pass policies by the end of the summer, prior to the beginning of this school year. So we had quite a difficult time actually getting this into court. But we eventually got a date, July 21st, where we were asking for a statewide injunction. And we basically were saying, hey, put the brakes on this, stop it, and suspend these, so that the Department of Education has to go back. They've got to address our concerns, and then they have to actually fix the legal problems with it, so that whatever they put out, schools who have to follow these, it won't violate all these rights and laws. And so that was what we were asking for. And in response, the Attorney General said, hey, you don't have standing to sue. You don't even have a right to bring this challenge. And we thought, oh, of course we do. The statute is clear. And then they said, and you shouldn't get a preliminary injunction. And we thought, okay, well, we've got a good case, but you never know what a judge will do on something like an injunction. And so what we found out, we had that hearing, and to our great surprise, the judge said, you don't have standing. And we were really shocked, because it's like, if we don't have standing, then who does? So we think he was wrong, but there wasn't time to appeal it because of the timing, and school's about to start again. But what we thought was a very unfortunate outcome actually turned out to be pretty positive in practice. And we've heard and we've seen the fruits of that in the various counties. And 2 things really came out of it. During the hearing, the Attorney General was asked by the judge, hey, if school boards don't adopt these policies consistent with these model policies, are they going to lose their funding, which was being threatened all across the state? And the Attorney General admitted, no, they're not going to lose their funding. He said, okay, that's good to know. And then secondly, when the judge gave his ruling, he clarified that these were actually merely guidance, that they weren't regulations that sort of had the force of law, as we were saying they effectively were. He said, no, they're just guidance. So we said, okay, we'll take his word for it. They're just guidance, then they might as well just be suggestions. And school boards don't have to follow these. So those 2 things actually gave a lot of courage and cover to a lot of school boards across the state who really didn't want to pass these, but they felt like they had to. And so we've seen a lot of good momentum with school boards across the state saying, okay, we're not going to lose our funding, and we don't have to follow them verbatim. And a lot of them have just been rejecting them outright. So that's kind of where things stand with that.
Well, thank you for kind of getting us up to speed on the lawsuit. And the complementary piece to that is that we've at the Family Foundation been doing this Protect Every Kid campaign, and that is that we've identified school divisions that we think this is winnable, and we've gone in and we're kind of strengthening the spines of the people that are on the school board to say, yes, you can resist. And we're helping parents kind of just equip them with, these are some words that can be effective as you message this when you're speaking with your school board member. And it's been a struggle for a lot of school boards. We know that. I can think of one particular conversation I had with a administrator who said, well, we just feel very conflicted because we don't want to do this, but the law says that we have to. And I shared with this individual, I said, you know, if you feel conflicted, imagine what's going to happen when you push this policy onto all the teachers in your school district. When they know this is harmful to children, but you're putting that conflict you feel, you're putting that on every single teacher that you have in your school system, some of them to the point where they will feel unable to comply and struggle with whether they'll be able to keep their job. And so that's been the challenge. And we know one of the biggest counties that we started with was working, kind of the starting point was working with a Southwest county, Russell County. Not big by population, big because they had a big win. But Josh, tell us a little bit about how Russell County kind of helped the Protect Every Kid campaign, and I think is helping protect school districts.
So one of the things that we told school districts is we put together a list of the main ways that these model policies actually violate the law and violate students' rights, parents' rights, and teachers' rights. And so Russell took us seriously on that. And what we helped draft a resolution that they ended up passing, which you can actually go on our website, familyfoundation.org, and you can go to our Protect Every Kid page, and you can find a virtual copy of that resolution, and you can give it to your school board. But it laid out some of the concerns that and the laws that mattered, like the parental rights statute and the religious freedom statutes and the privacy rights. And then it ended by saying, you know, we think our policies are fine, and we think if we did pass these policies, they've got all kinds of constitutional issues. So we're not going to pass that. And they voted 7-0. And the momentum that created was tremendous. And they also opposed the Virginia School Board Association's recommended policies, which are kind of a sleight of hand, confusing, putting a legal reference into the code section about this, that it's questionable what those really are. And so we've helped a number of counties reject those as well, and just said, we don't have to do this. And not only do we not have to, if we do, we'll be violating all kinds of laws. So that's been really encouraging.
And this has been fantastic where that has happened, but there are some school divisions that have adopted these policies or something close to them, or maybe a more comprehensive version. Loudon was one that everybody heard about by now, but these are going to have impacts. So what should teachers expect this coming year and going forward?
All teachers need to be very much aware of what policy their school boards have passed or decided not to pass anything. And then if you're in those certain counties, maybe like Loudon and Fairfax, Chesterfield just passed one, a couple of others have passed ones similar to what the VDOE put out. You need to be very aware of what you could be facing. And I'm just going to point out three main things. And the first one is you've got to figure out what their policy on pronouns and names are, because this is going to be a huge issue for teachers, as it has already been. You've got to decide, am I going to be willing to call a child their new preferred name, which you may be. Names are not inherently gendered, but in certain cases, it may be a problem for you. And then pronouns or titles, Miss, Mr., or he, she, or all kinds of other made up pronouns. That's going to be an issue. And I think there's a lot of good reasons to think that this is going to be a winning issue for free speech and free religious exercise. There's some court cases working their way through to determine this, but that's probably the number one thing. The other thing is going to be this compelled training. They might require you to do some training on LGBTQ affirming things, and maybe even incorporate into the curriculum some things that affirm this ideology that maybe you don't agree with. We've already helped at least one teacher write a letter asking to be opted out of this for religious reasons. And so that's one thing you should think about. If you're uncomfortable going through indoctrination training, essentially, uh, you ought to be able to opt out for religious reasons, or and so can keep that in mind, as well as teaching things. If you're having to teach something, one thing you could do is teach it as a theory and say, this is one way that some people view this issue, and here's another way that some people view this issue. You don't have to teach it as a fact. And the third thing is going to be privacy concerns. The various policies, in some cases, allow or direct things to be kept from parents about the status of their students. FERPA is the privacy law that prevents student records from being shared with just anyone. But parents have a right under that federal statute to know the information about their child. And so teachers really do have a lot of rights and responsibilities to share certain things with parents when they see that their child is struggling with something, or that other students may be violating the privacy rights of that child. Parents, our teachers have rights to share these things with parents, but we've got some resources on that if anyone's more interested in that. But that's going to be an issue of privacy. So you need to first know what the policies are, and then keep us in mind, the foundingfreedomslaw.org. If we can help you through specific questions, we certainly will. But those are the main things.
I so appreciate that. I mean, what I'm hearing you say is know the policies, so know what you're expected to do, and then pre-plan a how you're going to handle it, right? So walk in with, this is what I believe, as you really have to wrestle with this before you're thrown into the situation of having to apply it. So think through what this is going to mean for you. If you watch a boy walk into a girl's bathroom, how are you going to handle that moment? If you have a child who believes they are another gender in your classroom and wants to be handled with another pronoun, what are you going to do? We have had, as you know, litigation in Virginia. And I want to remind folks about one particular case, which was the Peter Vlaming case. And the reason I want to remind you of that, so that was a teacher in West Point, Virginia, that was fired simply for non-use of pronouns. Josh would say it in a better way, but basically it's just, he said, I'm going to create a gender neutral classroom in the sense that I don't need to call people he and she because they're all in front of me. So I'll use their names. And he agreed to use a new name for a child who is living out a life as a different gender than their biological sex. And he, unfortunately for that, was fired. And the reason I share that is not to be gloom and doom, but it is to say that happened under a non-discrimination policy. That wasn't even this full onslaught of policies that are being put in front of you. So everyone needs to be prepared for these moments. And beautifully, he's being defended legally, and we're working through the courts, and we do believe he'll be exonerated because we believe he has done nothing wrong. And in America, we don't compel speech. That's just the country that we live in, and we are standing by that. And we're thrilled with our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom that are taking that to help him. But I just wanted to kind of bring that up because that was under non-discrimination laws. So don't think that just because you haven't seen the policy that's going to force you to do this, or you don't have the student yet. I just want everybody to be prepared. Josh, did you say something?
If your school board policy has the term gender identity in the non-discrimination language, all of these things could still apply. You need to be aware of that. And there's one other thing I want to say. There's been a lot of discussion among teachers in recent about whether should I resign? Should I go somewhere else? Is this time for me to retire? Well, it might be, and that's between you and your family and God, and you'll have to really think and pray through that. But I will say, a lot of these things are very legally defensible, but unfortunately, you have to get reprimanded in some way, or even possibly fired, in order to have a grievance or a harm that we could go into court and challenge. So before you just resign, think about how you should make them fire you, because then you'll really have a legal claim. Now, understand that legal claims take time, and it means life's going to be difficult still. But we're here to represent folks, and there are others. But just keep that in mind before if you resign, there's no legal recourse that you have. And so.
No, I appreciate that, because we at the Family Foundation, we have just honored and revered teachers who especially are in the public school because they want to be a light in a secular place that doesn't necessarily believe everything that we believe. And so we're not saying abandon your post to people who are trying to do the right thing, be an important place, be an important mentor in children's lives. And so what I want to do real quick, because we are running low on time, is I want to get to a couple questions and answers. Going to bring Brandon back on because I know some of these definitely are maybe more directed for you, Brandon. How important is it to resist the use of pronouns? Or you even mentioned not calling someone, not even really engaging the term gender or calling someone transgender. Tell us how important you think that is, because I have heard Christians say, look, these are just words, and I am not trying to start conflict, which is we're called to be peacemakers. We're called to love. So walk us through your thoughts about that.
Well, yes, it's an important consideration, and I would just want to echo what Josh said a moment ago about the legal aspect in terms of what this will likely entail for free speech, compelled, religion, that all of the legal aspects of this are going to have to be worked out. And so I think teachers and school, employees are going to have to navigate these waters as best they can. Speaking for myself and other people who are, involved in this particular space, you need to remember that language shapes thought, and that you don't want to borrow a line from Solzhenitsyn, live by lies. I would say live not by lies. And it's insidious because, there is no better way to confuse someone than by renaming something and by changing up our very means of communication. You really do a disservice when you hijack words and their meanings in order to achieve a certain outcome, in order to sort of manipulate public perceptions of things. And so don't play the game. Just be a person of integrity, because without accurate language, we can't name the problem. And I keep saying that I am not one to quote French revolutionaries very often, but I keep quoting this one, and that's Voltaire, who said that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Well, I would respectfully submit that there is no better way to make someone believe an absurdity than by changing our very means of communication, by twisting that into something utterly unrecognizable. So if you mangle language, you mangle everything. And if you concede language, you've conceded half the battle already. So you're going to have to make those determinations and those calls as you're navigating the legalities of it in your school environment. But pronouns denote sex. We've known this, and it doesn't stop there. And I'll say, even if you capitulate to it, and even if you give in, this crowd, the radical gender identity activists, are not satisfied with even that. You're not going to win, even if you do capitulate. So don't think that by, just maybe taking a more peaceful, don't want to instigate approach, something else will come up. So this is just, you don't think that you're going to win, because you won't. This entire project rests upon this abusive behavior, this deliberate confusion. Don't kowtow to it. We don't, at the Christian Post, we've made the decision we will not overwrite the truth of biology. We will not lie in this way. It's a form of lying. And I think we should be people of integrity and always tell the truth.
Awesome. I've got another question here about how do you recommend, what do you recommend if the school counseling division is advising the teachers not to inform the parents, right? This happens, the student might not be in a good place. And I have seen in the General Assembly in particular that so often the worst case example of parents, so because there is an abusive parent somewhere, gets kind of like put on the view of all parents, and all of a sudden we're cut out of this important part of our child's life. So what do the teachers do if that's the scenario?
take
I
a
think,
first crack at that, or go ahead, Brandon.
well, was that directed to me? I have a few thoughts, but Josh might be a better person to say that. Now, I have a few thoughts on that too, but maybe Josh go first.
I'll be quick. I think one of the first things you need to do is expose it. Expose what the schools are doing. Tell the Family Foundation or Founding Freedoms Law Center, let this be known. Now, you can do this in a way in which you can still remain anonymous. But once people find out in the community what's going on, that's going to be the best way to combat this. Now, secondarily, under FERPA, if you know your rights, if you understand FERPA laws, you realize you can tell parents, because parents are entitled to know, and they're entitled to the full record of their students, of what's going on with their students. So you, regardless of what they tell you, the law is the law. But I think you first need to cover yourself a little bit and make it known.
One quick tag on to that. We did have a question. FERPA applies for what, 18 and under? So at 18, like if you're a high school senior, we're kind of out of luck there, or?
It applies to, well, it's about parents' rights, so it would be under 18. If it's over 18, I suppose the rights, the privacy rights would belong to the individual who's 18 or older. So yeah, so be careful if you're dealing with seniors, but you know, for the most part, it's going to apply to K through 12.
Awesome. Go ahead, Brandon. Sorry.
No, I will just second what Josh said. Let me say, you know, for anyone who's watching, who's a teacher or a school employee where you might be entangled in one of these unfortunate situations, I hate to say it, but there might be a point where you just have to take a huge risk and be bold and maybe even be willing to lose your job or be a sacrificial lamb. You're in a war. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's really brutal out there. And so if I was a teacher and I was faced with a situation where I knew the school was hiding something from a parent, and I would just probably use my judgment. If I knew that this student had parents, if I'd met the parents, I would probably violate that and say, no, the school will not hide this kind of information. Maybe wouldn't give all the details, but just find a way to communicate to the parents, because I think that is just a grotesque violation of parents' rights. Schools to actually insert themselves as the caring, loving authority that knows best. No, 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 no. Parents know best. Their family is the centerpiece here. The schools, how dare them try to do that? So that just gets me very hot under the collar. So I would say take a risk, but Josh was saying earlier, expose it. Go talk to a journalist. Find someone who's willing. That they've got this forum where they're trying to do this kind of insane thing, and this was not done to my knowledge. Yes, expose it.
I would step in here and say that when he said kind of talk to a journalist, I would also say really read some of the things that Brandon has been writing about. I really encourage you to just do a little Google search on some of these articles, because I learned so much this morning in our event, just hearing the stories and the grief. If you fully understand parents who are far down this road, and you have ever read any of the real medical experimental, what's actually happening when a child takes that step, and you realize the pronouns is just step one. Pronouns is like, that's like the soft stuff, but down the road is pain, harm, and destruction. You'll feel a little bit braver than you did before you read that about stepping in and saving a kid's life. And yes. I don't say that lightly, having read some things and having listened to Brandon's knowledge on this and hearing from some of the parents. So I encourage you to do that as a piece of kind of gearing yourself up for the school year and the world that we're in, is just being a person who knows enough to understand why we can't simply tolerate or be kind or walk the path. And then a couple quick things, and we are going to have to kind of wrap this up. One question that was real easy to answer, which is how do we get last week's missed webinar? There is a link in the chat, so you can snag that link, and then you can watch that at your convenience. And then this was recorded. And so I know we had the same scenario last week where people missed out, but then wanted to tell their friends, or they joined and heard it was so great and wanted to pass it along. So it is recorded. We need somebody to just register to get the link. So that's still we'll leave the registration kind of open so the links are available. And the last thing I want to do is answer the question on what do we do if our school board's already passed this? Is there anything else we can do? And I'll just answer that because that's sort of the grassrootsy side of things. I will tell you, school boards are elected, or they are appointed by your elected board of supervisors. So there's a few places in Virginia where your supervisor board actually appoints your school board. But in most of Virginia, you, the people, pick your elected officials. Now, normally you pick them at certain defined dates, such as when they're up for re-election. However, there are people in Virginia working to create new dates by which they would elect new elected officials. And that is to say, there are people in Loudoun County in particular working on recalls. That is an avenue, is a difficult avenue, but it is an avenue. You should be putting pressure on, because they know and seeing, you might want to make sure they're aware that recalls happen in Virginia. They don't happen often, but they are in the news right now in Loudoun County. So I would just say the pressure still should be on. It's not like it's done. It's a past issue. No, it's a very living, present issue. If you happen to see today, we had this whole governor mandate on masks. I'm not going to go there, but what I am going to tell you is I was interested in one county that responded and they said, okay, we're going to have to do masks because the governor's telling us we have to. But what they said is, we're going to visit this policy every 2 weeks. We're going to review this policy. That means they have the capacity and capability to change policies every 2 weeks. That's not any different on this issue as it is on the mask issue or any other issue. A school board can change their mind at any given moment. They can grow a spine and say, the damage of this policy is too much, we're backing off. And so we're telling folks, don't relent, don't give up, don't say we lost in our county, it's over. In fact, most of the places it has passed, people are totally still utterly unaware that this is the new policy. So tell your friends and then start moving on the school board. Josh.
I want to say something really important because you all are teachers on here, most of you. Teachers are the eyes and the ears of what's going on in the schools. So most parents, they won't have any idea. And there may be no particular policy on the books, but in practice, they may be doing things that are egregious. And we know that that's happening. So teachers are in the best position to let us know if and when things are occurring that are problematic. If boys are going into the girls' locker room, if teachers are being compelled to do things, you all have to let us know, because if you don't, it's going to be really hard for us to know. And there are things we can do. There's steps we can take. Anything from sending demand letters to religious exemption letters to lawsuits. And we think some of that's coming, but you're in the best position to let us know those things.
Absolutely. Well, Brandon, I'm going to give you the last word before I just say thank you. What did we not cover that is like the thing, or we didn't say it loud enough or often enough? What would you say to these teachers that are starting their school year under this situation?
I think I would just reiterate that this is a medical scandal. What we're fighting is a medical scandal. And so it's so important to realize the far-reaching repercussions. And I believe that very soon, I'm not going to put an exact timetable on it, the harms and the devastation, the utter atrocities of what this movement is, the havoc that this is wreaking on the bodies of very young people is so horrific and beyond words terrible. You need to see it for what it is. I'll just say very quickly to your point about, pronouns, not capitulating on that, because then that sort of beginning stages of something. I once interviewed a transitioner man who I since lost touch with him, but he talks about how that was actually what you said was exactly right. That's what started him down the pathway of him ultimately winding up getting an orchiectomy, which is his testicles amputated. And I will spare you the nightmarish details of how that destroyed his body and his mind and his endocrine system. And it's absolutely grotesque what's going on in the minds and in the bodies of young people, and how these medical corporations and pharmaceutical companies and LGBT activist groups are exploiting these kids. And so just know that that's actually what you're up against. The zoom out. If people want to, you said check my articles out, I'll just take this opportunity to recommend 2 resources that I think are especially important. One of them is a speech I gave. It's on YouTube. You can go find it, where it's just sort of a summation of a lot of my reporting, my journalistic work on the subject. I gave it last year at the Ruth Institute in Louisiana. Just put into YouTube, reporting on the transgender movement. I share stories from reporting on the transgender movement, my name, and then you'll find about a 40-minute speech where I share stories from parents and how this is affecting young people. And the other resource that I cannot recommend strongly enough is a documentary film that's free to watch on YouTube and Vimeo. It's called Transmission: What's the Rush to Reassign Gender, by Jennifer Law and Callie Fell of the Center for Bioethics and Culture. It's excellent. It's 50 minutes. You'll get a swift education. And its main audience is parents. And so I think teachers will appreciate it as well.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Brandon, for being with us this evening. Josh, for squaring us up on sort of the legal side of this thing. And I just want to kind of close by reminding people, this is the most loving way we can love, is to spare a child. It isn't, don't buy the line that we should be affirming this because the path is too destructive. The harm is too severe. And so I just encourage you to love on these kids, but help them back to find a way to square up where they're thinking. And don't ignore the fact that this is trending, that this is actually, you see trends in your schools among kids. This is literally becoming a popular thing. And that is where we can stop it, where it is not truly a source of mental anguish that started outside in a bubble. It actually is a peer pressure created thing. And so be on the lookout for things that are sort of creating cultures where this is raised up as a good thing within your class settings. So with that, I'm going to suggest that you grab that link for last week's webinar in the toolbox. And again, if you have any questions, our website, familyfoundation.org, the legal center is Founding Freedoms Law. So check out those 2 places where you can get some resources, and feel free to submit any questions to us through that mechanism. So thank you so much for being here tonight. And teachers, we hope you have a fantastic back to school year. It sounds like we've had a lot of doom and gloom, but God has put you in that classroom, and we believe you can be a powerful force for good in the lives of these kids. So thank you so much, and have a great night.